So for the purposes of clarity, I've taken all of the other components in this fortress here, having already hidden the other three flak guns, and I have placed those within a new empty structure called fortress. And that not only makes the hierarchy a little bit neater, but it means that I can hide them all at once, and therefore we can just focus on this one gun structure. I could even hide the plane if I wanted to, but I think we can probably deal with that. And even within the gun structure itself, I can hide this flak tower that the gun is resting on, because that was simply a cylinder appropriately sized and with a concrete texture applied to it. There's no code associated with it. And so this really leaves us with the components that interest us. And in fact, this would still operate independent of everything else. If I played it, there it is, tracking the jet as it begins to taxi. And as I take off in the jet, once it reaches the right altitude, start firing until it probably hit the jet. So this structure, minus the cylinder that it's sitting on, is composed of two basic components: the gun base and the guns. Guns is itself an empty object, which includes some real objects, and I'm going to turn it off so we can just focus on what I could call either the turret, because it's the thing that turns horizontally along the y-axis, or I could call it the gun base, as I did here. And gun base is not an empty object. I could have created it as one, actually, but I didn't. This actual base structure here is a very flattened cylinder. And then the gun supports are just cubes that are made very thin and appropriately sized. And then there's a cylinder which is sort of partly inset into them. I made one of these and I duplicated it and dragged it over. So you've got a right support and a left support. And this sort of defines the axis along which the gun, where the gun is going to sit, and how it's going to rotate, how it's going to do its own movement. So to the gun base here, I've applied the turret control script, which is what is going to be responsible for our horizontal rotation, just along the y-axis. We will look at that later when we look at the code. So that's the gun base, which would also operate independently right now if I played it, except that there's no active movie, so Unity would complain about that. So now if I was to hide the gun base, now everything has disappeared, but now I'm going to take the guns empty object and unhide that. So there's the guns with their camera attached. And as I said, this is an empty object composed of a left gun and a right gun, and there's also a gun shelf. So the left gun is a cylinder that's just been appropriately sized out, so it's very long. And I've added a breech to the end of it, which I found that it works better during the rotation if you keep these as separate components rather than, so the only child of this gun, or I could have called it a gun barrel, the only child is the actual fire point itself. So there's the left gun barrel, the right gun barrel, the gun shelf, which is several different components because it is, on the one hand, this thing in the center, which is sort of what supports the guns at the point where they also pivot. So it's got a couple of cylinders attached to it, and those are going to join up with those larger cylinders in the two gun supports. So there's that, but the gun shelf also includes, for convenience, because this wasn't a problem in rotating, I created a little ammunition holding canister here that I just made an olive drab color in order to make it easier to see. By the way, all of these textures I've just created. This is sort of a gunmetal. If you've ever seen military guns, they tend to be this sort of dark silver gray that probably realistically wouldn't be applied to cannon, or at least the barrels of the cannon, but would be applied to smaller things like a machine gun. And I figured it wasn't an issue here. If we go back and look at the gun base, I have come up with a slightly lighter metallic gray silvery color for that. That's different enough that we can visually differentiate between that and the guns themselves. So those are the basic components that make up guns. And again, I've added this camera just so that we could watch it for this demonstration. It's not in the actual game. You can only have one main camera, of course, in your scene active at one time, and I've got one following the jet. So the gun empty object has a gun control script applied to it, and its purpose is to aim these guns up and down. Turret handles the horizontal rotation. This script handles the vertical elevation, we would call it. And then there's also a fire control script, which is in charge of telling these guns, specifically the 2 fire points, when to fire. The fire points themselves have a fire spawn script, which spawns both the actual shells, and also there's a bit of a smoke effect that goes with that. So we've got the fire points with the fire spawn script, and we'll dive into the scripts next.